'Tis the season to be weary, fa la 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 la, of the coughing that is scary, fa la 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 la. Beskar ma hula dunya agus falcha guna video. A vel shiv guma? Pami becken chinen drasta. Ach, na gavdrag. Can ye virus corona hang? Hami and Dochus. This is a quick video about another pandemic from an unknown country of origin. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, the pestilence, the Great Mortality, which peaked in Europe between the years 1347 and 1351, killing around half the continent's population, some 100 million people. The plague spread primarily through maritime trade routes, reaching ports and then travelling inland as goods were distributed throughout the kingdoms of Europe. It first reached England through the vassal state of Gascony in modern-day France, the ownership of which precipitated the 100 Years' War. The first known case of the plague in England was in Weymouth, Dorset, in June 1348. Estimates suggest that between 40 and 60% of the population of England were killed by December that same year. The 100 Years' War was halted during the plague as it affected both the English and French armies. There was a huge shortage of labour, ultimately leading to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 and the end of serfdom in England. Before the Black Death hit, England was a prospering kingdom within Europe, under the youthful and energetic kingship of Edward III. During this time, the Scottish Wars of Independence were still raging. In 1328, Robert the Bruce, who had won a decisive victory against the English under Edward II at Bannockburn in 1314 and under Edward III at Stanhope Park in 1327, signed a peace treaty with England, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, bringing about the end of the First Wars of Scottish Independence. The terms were that, in exchange for £100,000 sterling, England would recognise that the Kingdom of Scotland was fully independent, Robert the Bruce and his heirs were the rightful rulers of Scotland, and that the border between the two countries was to be recognised as they had been in the reign of Alexander III, the death of whom, without an heir, had led to the wars in the first place. Edward III of England signed the treaty and promised his daughter, Joanna, would marry Robert the Bruce's son, the future King David II of Scotland. The treaty lasted a mere 5 years, and was overturned by Edward III in 1333, due to it being unpopular among his nobles, who felt that it was a humiliation and capitulation. Robert the Bruce had died in 1329, and Edward Balliol, son of John Balliol, the Bruce's main rival for the kingship before the first Wars of Scottish Independence, rekindled the feud of his father with Edward III's support. Scotland was in a weakened position as Robert the Bruce's only son, David II, was only 5 years old when he ascended the throne. This led to a series of losses against the English in battle, and Edward Balliol gaining control of some of the country, and David II being exiled to France. By 1341, however, David's representatives had regained the upper hand, and King David II returned to Scotland, taking control of the country aged 17. Since 1337, England had been embroiled in the 100 Years' War with France over the ownership of the aforementioned Gascony, and Scotland, duty-bound by the Auld Alliance to stand with France against England, invaded Northumbria but were defeated at the Battle of Neville's Cross on the 17th of October 1346. King David II was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, remaining incarcerated for the following 11 years. The English also defeated the French during this time. And then, in 1348, the plague arrived in England, decimating the population. The story goes that it reached Scotland when the Scots, seeing their enemy weakened, decided to attack and raided Durham, taking the deadly disease back home with them. By 1350, it had ravaged the entire north. There actually appears to be little evidence of an invasion by Scotland at this time, but the combination of the plague and the fear of a potential invasion caused riots on the streets of Durham. Henry Knighton writes, "The Scots, hearing of the cruel plague of the English, declared that it had befallen them through the revenging hand of God, and they took to swearing by the foul death of England, or so the common report resounded in the ears of the English. And thus the Scots, believing that the English were overwhelmed by the terrible vengeance of God, gathered in the forest of Selkirk with the intention of invading the whole realm of England. The fierce mortality came upon them, and the sudden cruelty of a monstrous death winnowed the Scots. Within a short space of time, around 5,000 of them had died, and the rest, weak and strong alike, decided to retreat to their own country. It seems unlikely that this would be the only way for the plague to reach Scotland, considering it had already reached Scandinavia, and the northeast of Scotland was still under the control of the Kingdom of Norway. But the story remains that the retreating army and their baggage carried the plague home with them in the autumn of 1349. Things seemed to die down over the harsh Scottish winter, but the plague broke out once more in the spring of 1350. In 1350 there was a great pestilence and mortality of men in the Kingdom of Scotland, and this pestilence also raged for many years before and after in various parts of the world. So great a plague has never been heard of from the beginning of the world to the present day, or been recorded in books. For this plague vented its spite so thoroughly that fully a third of the human race was killed. At God's command, moreover, the damage was done by an extraordinary and novel form of death. Those who fell sick of a kind of gross swelling of the flesh lasted for barely 2 days. This sickness befell people everywhere, but especially the middling and lower classes, rarely the great. It generated such horror that children did not dare to visit their dying parents, nor parents their children, but fled for fear of contagion as if from leprosy or a serpent. And in March 2020, people did descend on the lands of Tesco, Aldi and Asda, and while they did return home triumphant with their wares of toilet paper and pasta, they took home with them the very disease they were trying to avoid. So the moral of the story is, don't invade countries that have the plague, don't go outside during a pandemic unless it's absolutely necessary, and wash your f***ing hands.